Hello, and welcome to part two of our four-part series dealing with European imperialism. These next three presentations are each going to deal with different areas of the world where Europe was trying to exert its influence. These are notes 11.2b, and this is, of course, Mr. Marks. One of the more interesting stories when it comes to the roles of missionaries, which we had just finished talking about in the last presentation, is that of David Livingstone, often heard of as Dr. Livingstone. In fact, you may have even heard about him before if you ever heard the phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. This story of this one missionary captured the imagination of the world, and yet at the same time serves as a real reminder of kind of the arrogance of the Europeans as they were moving through especially the continent of Africa. See, David Livingstone, he was a Scottish pioneer missionary, okay? And one of his real goals was to discover the source of the Nile. Now, he was a popular hero at the time. He sent back writings and books would be published of his journeys. But they did not always go so well. In fact, Livingstone, on his last trip into Africa, found himself without any of his food, without any of his guides. His prize horse had been killed, and completely out of contact with Europe. In fact, chances are he probably would have starved to death if he hadn't happened to hook up with a group of slavers. Now, this is a time when Britain itself wasn't really for slavery. So it's kind of a blemish on his record that while he's trying to bring Christianity to places, and he himself is against slavery, he believed that bringing Christianity was the only way to end the slave trade. He's actually following this group of slavers who are giving him food and giving him shelter as he's going around preaching about the evils of slavery. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. He was really a rags to riches story. He was came from a poor family, and managed to make this large name for himself. So when he disappeared, nobody heard anything for him for years, and people were used to regular updates from him. It became quite a stir. It was something akin to the way that we think about celebrities in tabloids and such. The question of what happened to Dr. Livingstone was on a lot of people's minds, and it'll be an intrepid reporter by the name of Henry Morton Stanley who will go to his editor, his newspaper editor, and say, I've got the best story possible. You give me enough funds, and I will mount an expedition to find David Livingstone, and I'll report back regularly in order to talk about this search. This became one of the largest followed stories in history when it comes to newspapers. People were constantly looking forward to the next update that Stanley could send back, talking about his progress as he hears tales of a white man who had been in areas where white men had never been before. He starts hearing rumors and he pieces them together until eventually he actually makes it all the way up into a secluded village and discovers a not quite healthy David Livingstone and says his famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? David Livingstone would actually not live much longer after this meeting. He was already quite ill. And just to give you an idea as to how popular it was in both Africa and in Europe, when he died in 1873, he he had his remains sent to Europe, but the African tribesmen who were there refused at first, and only after the British completely insisted and suggested a force of arms did they send the body to Great Britain, but without his heart. His heart actually ended up being buried beneath a tree, and it's reported that they said, a note was sent with the body that said, "You can have his body, but his heart belongs in Africa." Not everything was nice, though, when it came to European relationships in Africa. One of the real issues was, as had been noted, as we noted in the last presentation. The Europeans believed it was their right, their destiny, and in fact part of their evolutionary heritage to dominate other people. And in Berlin, which was becoming a much more central power, which we're going to talk about later when we talk about the unification of Germany. In Berlin from 1884 to 1885, a long-term conference was held with representatives from all of the major European nations. And it's there that they literally cut up Africa. Different countries were arguing over who was allowed to explore what areas, especially since the British had pushed so deep in with the movements of Livingstone and other explorers. Germany was trying to establish its dominance as a colonial power at this time as well, and it's one of the reasons that they decided to hold their conference right there. In the end, what they do is they come to an agreement that within the next several years, the European country that could establish a sustainable government, all they had to do is create an embassy, create a building that they could call an embassy, and supply it with workers to an area, would have control of that area as a colony. The race was on. The European countries attempted to outmaneuver each other in their frantic grab for land. The French attempted to form a line from the east coast to the west, but they got stopped by the British. The British tried to form a line from Egypt in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south, and they ended up being blocked temporarily by the Germans. This was a rush that was completely all about European greed. They did not care at all for the native peoples that they were taking over, aside from the missionaries who were hoping to get those natives out of their traditional views and bring them to the fold of Christianity. In the end, as you can see, maybe not all that clearly, Africa became this hodgepodge of European-controlled areas. Only two countries would never be colonized. Liberia, which is the arrow that's on the left there, was formed by freed American slaves, and the United States had them under its protection and did not allow other Europeans to get involved in its government or in taking control of that area. The other one was Ethiopia, and Italy had made an attempt to try to take it over and had failed. Ethiopia, if you remember from earlier, is a Christian nation inside Africa, and so Italy didn't get the support of the other European nations because it was attacking a place that they couldn't make the claim of sending missionaries in there. It was a major embarrassment for Italy, and that will actually later on come into play during World War II. So, just as a quick review, who was Dr. Livingstone? That should be Stone, not Stun. What was the result of the Berlin Conference? You should also remember, I don't have the question on here, but what two countries would not fall under European rule? And then what was the effect of imperialism in Africa?